One of Swedenborg's notions that I find delightful is the concept of aging in the world to come. When a soul crosses over to young age, he writes, she will grow older and into her prime. But if she lives to the ripe old age of 90, she will age in reverse, growing younger back into her zenith. Our true spirit bodies, which he claimed were megatons more real and alive than our earthly ones, appear and behave as the ideal 35-year-old. I have often heard this idea reflected in stories of dreams and visions of those presumed to be dead. In fact, I had one such dream myself. I had a friend who was somewhere in her 60s when she died about 30 years ago. Up until her death, she had worked as a cook for my mother, who had hired her when I was a teenager. She was African American, 5 feet tall, and nearly as round, with the bright, open face of a 10-year-old. Her name was Allie, and she was a favorite among all who came to our house. She was a fierce champion of equality and commanded a respectful position among the members of my family. Allie and I were very close, and she often introduced me to newcomers as her baby. Allie took the feline approach to death and brushed against it 9 times before it took her. She had been in and out of the hospital with complications due mostly to asthma and the devastation of the drugs prescribed for it before she gave up the fight. In the late 80s, shortly before she died, I went home for a visit. Entering, as always, through the kitchen to have a nice chat with Allie, I found her much the same. She said that she'd been well, but mentioned that she'd been hearing voices. Whose voices? I asked. Well, dead people's voices, she answered. For instance, and she said, my brother, mother, friends. And what do they say? I prodded. Nothing much. Sometimes they just call my name. I took careful count of the number of close calls she had weathered. Just about 8, I figured. 2 months later, those voices called her home. Perhaps 10 years after Allie's death, my friend Patricia was visiting me in Pennsylvania for the weekend. Many years before, when I was in college, I had brought Patricia home to Louisville. She had naturally taken an immediate shine to Allie and would occasionally ask me about her. One night, during Patricia's visit, I had a dream about Allie that had all of the trappings of a visitation dream. Allie and I were having a comfortable chat when she pulled out a Polaroid snapshot from her pocket and began waving it in front of me. Look, she said enthusiastically, this is what I look like now. I studied the photo, which revealed an Allie that I had never witnessed on earth. She was in the perfect prime of life, as healthy as a young doe, and finely proportioned, looking as if she might have just had a light skip up the side of a mountain. You look wonderful, I exclaimed, and then shot out of my dream, keenly awake. I smiled, grateful for this glimpse of an old friend, and drifted happily back to sleep. The next morning, Patricia came down from her room and after a bit of coffee remembered a dream that she had had that night. It was about that wonderful woman who used to work for your mother, her cook. What was her name? Allie, I replied. Yes, Allie, she went on. This was Allie, all right, only she was about 35 and at least a third of her weight. Allie was busy last night, I answered, and shared my own dream. I often ask friends to search through their own histories for such dreams. My friend Sarah had a visitation dream of her father, which was long and luscious and full of spiritual wonders. If she hadn't needed it so much at the time, I could throttle her for not immediately taking pen to paper and recording every marvelous detail for me. Sarah was visiting her mother at the family farm on Lake Michigan the summer she had the dream. Her father, a gentle English professor, universally adored by the family, had died several months earlier on Christmas Day. And since that time, her mother had been quite lost, and the mood around the house was empty and mournful. After several weeks of pervasive sorrow, Sarah was given her dream. She was walking along the pebbly shore of the lake near her family home when at a slight distance a door appeared, a single door suspended above the beach. The door opened just inside stood her father. Directly on course with such dreams, he was radiantly healthy and looked to be somewhere in his hardy prime, an age Sarah could barely remember his ever being. He gestured for Sarah to come to him, but when she neared, he warned her that she was only to step just inside. She wasn't to venture beyond this point and mustn't stay too long. After their initial joyful greeting, Sarah began to ask him questions of his life on the other side of the door. Unlike other dreams she might have had about her father, she was very much aware that she was speaking with his departed soul. "What do you do here?" she asked. "How do you spend your time?" "It's difficult to explain," he answered. "Time here is not as you sense it on your side of the door. You might, if you dearly loved something, such as a poem, for instance, spend a month with that poem." Sarah's father had been a great lover of words. He continued, "Almost, you could say, spend a month inside the poem." He gave her to understand that those passionate interests that you uncover in your life on earth are further pursued in the coming world. The discovery of what you truly love in this life is of vital importance to the continuing soul. She asked him other questions which he attempted to answer, but he warned that no earthly explanation could begin to describe life on his side of the door because, and he was to repeat this several times, your world is just a suggestion of this world. This, he stressed, is the real world. During this conversation, Sarah made sneaky little attempts to trick her father into letting her stay, trying to inch past him and move further into his world. She had missed him very much, and it was all so inviting. Each such attempt was gently parried by her father. "No," he would say, "it isn't your time." She woke suddenly from the dream, much relieved of her heavy morning, still feeling the comforting presence of her father. The atmosphere of the house that day soon began to eat away at her comfort, and so she decided to leave it and take a walk. Perhaps, she began to doubt, this dream had simply been the contrived fantasy of a mind in grief, and not a real encounter with her father. As she stepped out of the sorrowful house for her walk, Sarah asked for some sign of encouragement to believe in the dream, the truth of which she had been so convinced during the experience. She asked specifically that the sign be in the form of a large bird. Birds had always symbolized the spirit for her. The walk was long and meditative, but brought nothing unusual, no avian wonders, and so she turned back toward her mother's house with diminishing faith. When she entered the front door, her mother called to her from where she sat at the kitchen window, transfixed by something she was studying outside. "Come and look," she urged. "He's been sitting there since you left the house." Sarah approached the window, and just outside, on a near tree limb, sat a very large owl. Entirely uninhibited, the great bird stared with fixed gaze at the two women inside. The owl wasn't to move from the window the whole day, finally taking off at dusk to fly low over the area where her father's ashes lay scattered. In my collection of such dreams, there doesn't seem to be any sort of time limit for a return visit of a departed soul. My Aunt Mina, who was widowed in her early 20s, had her first and only visitation dream of her deceased husband, my mother's brother, whom everyone called Possum, over 40 years after his death. Mina was well into her mid-60s at the time of the dream, and the two old lovers sat together looking through pictures of Mina's life since Possum had left the world. Mina had since married twice and had 2 children and several grandchildren. Content now with a large and loving family, Mina was able to show Possum how her life had played out since his departure and show him all of the love she had gathered. Possum seemed genuinely pleased for her and assured her that he too had found happiness. Toward the end of the dream, Mina called my grandmother, Possum's mother, to tell her that her son had not in fact died all those years ago in a car accident, but was still alive, more alive than ever. My grandmother, who had left the world 15 years earlier, replied, "But of course, dear, I've known that for years." I love such stories. I hope by the end of my life to have collected such a comfortable pile of them that I can tuck in amid them like a puppy with its litter and drift dreamily into the everlasting. Thank you. I wanted to ask whether any of you feel you have had a visitation dream. Anyone here? Yes. How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. About 7 or 8? Yeah, wonderful. I'd love to hear your stories. I promise I will only write about them if you allow me. Would like to... that is the longer piece, I'm warning you. I usually write just 10-minute pieces. So this is actually one that it has been recorded on the Listen Well site. There's quite a group of them on the site in the archive section. But this is another way that I feel the heavens communicate with us. It's called Any Voice Will Do. At the risk of losing some of my audience, I confess that I occasionally indulge in a session with a clairvoyant. I understand that some would disapprove. Emerson, for instance, that grand teacher, warns me to check this low curiosity. I'm sure he has good reason to caution, but I can't help myself. I've never managed to follow a rule for more than half a block, and I am deeply, compulsively curious about the divine workings behind the material world. Any hint that I might extract from whatever source available seems worth the transgression. And here is a little story to illustrate. When I was 23 and living in New York City, I met and fell in love with my husband, Matt. Several months later, he moved back to his home state of Tennessee, and I assumed that this was the end of our relationship. Sometime after Matt left the city, I had what I would call a light date with a young man. We were walking around the West Village, and on a lark, we decided to enter the door of a palm reader. At that time, there were a handful of these psychics on every block, and we randomly chose the door nearest us. The woman inside was quite ordinary, in street clothes, no turbans or faux gypsy garb. She took my hand, studied it for half a moment, lifted her head and looked at me. "You're in love with a man who has moved away," she said. I shuffled in my seat, aware of the young man next to me. The woman continued to look at me. I took a breath and returned her gaze. "Wait for him," she said. "He will come back for you." Back out on the street, my date turned to me. "Is that true?" he asked. "Are you in love with someone who has moved away?" "Yes," I admitted, a tad embarrassed. "Yes, it's true." My husband did, of course, return to me, and we married 9 months later. This story would seem to support the theory that when the divine has a message to deliver, any voice will do. Of course, there are other means of divine communication. There have been times in my life when silence was more pregnant with message than any number of words spoken. Several years ago, on my morning walk in the woods, I had an experience that was quite profound for me. At the time, I had been gathering essays on spiritual themes for many years, and I was having a tough time placing these writings. I must assume that I am not the first to find sitting and scribbling down one's ideas a lonely process. Please don't feel sorry for me. I am well befriended. But along with the attempt to gather my thoughts on faith came the fear that no one would ever benefit from them. And when my nose was to the ground, following some divine thread, I was quite content. But the moment I raised my head to wonder where this was all leading, I would feel the chill winds of doubt. And after many years of writing and failing to find readers, my courage started to lag. And the voice that would have me believe that my thoughts would never reach a single soul was the only one that I could hear. One day this voice was particularly cruel and piercing, convincing me that I might as well put down the pen that minute and admit defeat. There simply wasn't a place for my voice in the world conversation. I was walking along my familiar path in the woods, one that I walked daily, when this hopeless thinking grew so heavy that I felt as if I were carrying a crushing physical burden. I could barely lift my feet, and I feared I was about to crumble into a heap of despair. I stopped, steadied myself, and I said out loud, "I just can't do this alone anymore." Not 3 seconds passed before I felt, but did not see, a presence arrive at my side. A being who carried with them a feeling so loving, so deeply compassionate, that I was overwhelmed with a sense of sudden, profound empathy. I knew unequivocally that this someone was even more intensely sad for me than I was for myself, 100 times as sad. This willingness to share so heavily in the weight of my sorrow caused me to be instantly, keenly embarrassed by my fit of despair. I felt the need to apologize to this heavenly presence, and the next words out of my mouth were, "Oh dear, I'm so sorry to make you so sad. Please forgive me." I'm not sure how long I was in the company of this divine presence. Perhaps only the space of 3 minutes. But when I left the woods, I was washed clean by the encounter, as if the dark filth had been removed from my soul. 2 years later, while still frustrated by the obstacles to finding an audience for my writing, a friend recommended a clairvoyant to me. I arranged a phone session with her, and before I called, I decided not to ask anything specific, but to simply ask, "Why is it that I'm here?" She spoke uninterrupted for an hour while I listened. "Once," she said, "several years ago, you were very unhappy. You were alone, and you cried out for help." I held my breath and listened. "And," she continued, "you said out loud, 'I cannot do this alone.' Do you remember?" "Yes," I answered. "Now, this is where you may have a difficult time believing me," she continued. "In fact, I'm having a difficult time believing what I'm about to say. Someone came to you, a presence." "Yes," I repeated. "This being was Saint Teresa of Avila. Do you know anything about her?" I admitted that I did not. I was not raised in the Catholic Church and do not know my saints. Neither was the clairvoyant, she admitted, and couldn't tell me much about Saint Teresa, but continued, "Apparently she comes to those who are in great despair. She is a being of great empathy and is drawn to those in anguish. She brings absolute compassion." I could not disbelieve her. Of course, I cannot know the truth of who it was that visited me that day. The identification of the saint is minor next to the confirmation of divine attendance and the message that was conveyed by this presence. Principally that we are not alone. We never have been alone. We never will be alone. Our sorrows, goals, frustrations, fears, even our joys are held. By whom? I'm not sure that it matters. By another, by one other, by more than just ourselves. That one, thank you. And thanks. Now, I'm wondering how Being read to can be a rather dense experience, and so I do have one short piece left, but don't want to over-talk you. What do you think, Joe? Go for it? Okay, I'll go for it. But this is the last piece. This is also on the Listen Well site. It's a little lighter than the others. If I often write about prayer, it is because I think often about prayer. One of the reasons I visit the issue so often is that my thoughts on the theme are forever changing. My image of whom I am praying to is constantly shape-shifting, for instance, and my daily delivery is as various as styles of music. One day it might be the blues, and the next a rhapsodic symphony. And although I believe I am always heard, I am hardly ever convinced that I'm getting through. Therefore, I tend to go over the same tune hundreds of times. And even though my tendency is to be nagging, I have learned to temper my expectations of how a prayer might be answered. The answer is rarely what I had imagined. Several years ago, one of my kitties vanished. Button was under 2 years old at the time. Sweet, round-faced, white-masked, a petite beauty with the most unusual, tremulous voice. And although she had mastered much of the outside world, she could not have known all of its dangers as an older cat might. It was on Wednesday afternoon when Matt and I had last seen her. Thursday was fairly miserable with worry, and by early Friday morning I woke from a dream in full heart-throbbing panic. The weather was looking dreadful with sheets of rain coming down, and I had been dreaming that I was ululating over the absence of my dear Button. I lay in bed. It was 4 a.m, and I tried to breathe deeply to quiet my heart. At the same time, I began to beg the heavens for help. I was using every image in my image reservoir and some in my reserve tank. I tried asking politely, "Please help me with this." Then demanding, "You have to help me with this. I'm about to lose my mind." I tried employing guilt. "You were the one who brought her to me." I had trapped Button when she was 6 weeks old, along with her sister and mother, after I'd discovered them eating out of a dumpster behind a local store. "You can't possibly take her away without telling me what has happened to her." Finally, I tried repetitive begging. "Oh, please have mercy on me, have mercy on me, have mercy on me." I imagine that it is clear by now that I am utterly neurotic when it comes to the whereabouts of my pets. After an hour or so of restless nagging, I began to calm down. I believe what came next could not have happened if I had not managed to still my mind. My eyes were shut and I was breathing regularly. My heart was beating at a normal pace when a perfectly clear picture flashed in my mind's eye. For an instant, I saw a silhouette of a cat looking down from a branch in a tree. And although I understood what the image was telling me, I questioned its accuracy. But I thought, that doesn't really look like Button, at which point my vision zoomed in on the cat like a pair of binoculars, and I was shown Button's perfect little face. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," I crooned and fell instantly back asleep. The next day, my confidence in the vision of the night before began to wear away. By the evening, I announced to Matt that I was prepared to break a lifetime of self-reliance and search for a psychiatrist. Matt was not any help to me, being rather heartsick himself, but it was comforting to feel that I was not alone in my misery. We weathered the damp night together in clammy disquiet. 24 hours later, with a full-blown storm raging outside, my faith in the vision from the night before had all but crumbled away. Why, if Button were in a tree, had she not come down from her perch when the storm came on? Why was she choosing to wait out the weather in the tree? It was the middle of the night, and I was attempting to calm myself, slow my heart rate, and breathe. After about an hour, I was given another clear mental picture. This time it was of a section of a tree with leaves madly rocking around in the wind. The motion of the shaking leaves was so violent that I felt dizzy and slightly nauseated. What could that mean, I thought. And it wasn't until I woke several hours later that I deduced that this was what Button was seeing and feeling from her point of view in the tree. Of course, she would not choose to descend with such a dizzying, nauseating feeling. She would wait until the wind stopped before she made her way down. I wish I could tell you that this was enough to relieve my uneasiness, but I am a difficult case. In the morning, when the storm had passed and all was still, I woke very early and attempted to quiet my uneasiness. I heard the meow of a cat, but knew better than to allow myself to believe that it was Button. It was undoubtedly her sister, Doodad, and all of my nagging supplications had been to no avail. I would have to accept that Button was not coming back and begin the process of mourning. I quieted myself, began to breathe steadily, when the meow grew nearer and more silvery. Oh, I thought, unless Doodad has learned the art of ventriloquism, that must be... And suddenly Button leapt on the bed, her voice singing. My own answered in ecstatic joy. Button's here. Matt rolled over to see her, smiled, called her name, and went back to sleep, while I lay with Button through the early morning in a puddle of gratitude. I have thought much about these brief visions since this happened. I've known a handful of people who claim the gift of second sight. I have heard and shared my own small stories of knowing, flashes of insight, precognition, clairvoyance, clairaudience, precious gifts, all of them. When we are given any gift, from the tiniest gift of seeing something that is hidden from view to a striking ability to play an instrument, to sing, write, dance, paint, I imagine the attitude with which we receive the gift is critical. It would be bizarre to show off our gifts as if we had made them ourselves, for instance, or as I did, to bury them under such a heap of insecurity that they are of little use to us. The visions of Button in her tree were particularly precious because they were given in answer to a prayer for help. They came in unlooked-for packages, as is typical of answered prayers. They were just striking enough that they could have come from no other place but the spiritual world. But then that is true of all of our finest gifts. They cause us to say thank you, dear one. I will never forget you for this.